It was early morning on August 2nd, 216 BC, and a Carthaginian general stood on a ridge above the Apulian plain, watching an army nearly twice the size of his own march toward him. His name was Hannibal. He was 30 years old. He had invaded Italy 2 years earlier with 46,000 men and 37 elephants, and he had beaten the Romans at every turn. But on this morning something was different. His men were outnumbered. His supply lines were stretched. His cavalry was the only real advantage he had left, and as the Roman legions, 87,000 of them, marched into the valley below his position, Hannibal made a decision that every military school in the world would study 2,000 years later. He deliberately weakened his center. He put his worst soldiers in the middle of his line. He arranged them in a crescent shape, with the tip pointing toward the Romans, like a smile. Then he waited for the Romans to do exactly what they always did, and when they did, he destroyed them. Completely. So thoroughly that historians compare it to the massed slaughter of the first day of the Somme in World War I. But here's what makes this story incredible. Hannibal's strategy was so dangerous, so counterintuitive, so utterly wrong by every rule of military tactics that it almost got him killed. Because you don't win battles by letting the enemy crush your center. You don't stand your weakest soldiers in front of your strongest enemy. You don't deliberately make yourself look like you're breaking. Except Hannibal did all three, and it set the template for military victory for the next 2,000 years. To understand the Battle of Cannae, you have to understand Hannibal Barca, and you have to understand why he was desperate enough to try something so insane. Hannibal didn't grow up dreaming of conquering Rome. He grew up hating it. Carthage and Rome had fought once before in what historians call the First Punic War. It lasted 23 years. It was brutal. Carthage lost. More importantly, Carthage lost Spain, North Africa, and its position as the greatest power in the Mediterranean. When Hannibal was 9 years old, his father, Hannibal Barca, the greatest Carthaginian general of his time, took him to Spain. Hannibal was rebuilding Carthage's power base. He was raising an army that would someday strike back at Rome. And according to legend, Hannibal made his son swear an oath. Not in words, but in blood. He made Hannibal place his hand on a sacrificial altar and swear eternal hatred toward Rome. Whether that story is true or not doesn't matter. What matters is that Hannibal believed it. By the time he was a man, he had one purpose: to destroy Rome. In 221 BC, when Hannibal was about 26 years old, his father died. The Carthaginian army in Spain voted to make Hannibal their commander. The ruling council in Carthage, the Senate, reluctantly approved. For 5 years, Hannibal consolidated power in Spain. He built an army. He recruited soldiers from local tribes. He trained them. He prepared them for something that Rome thought was impossible. He was preparing to invade Italy itself. In 219 BC, Hannibal attacked Saguntum, a city allied with Rome, but south of the Ebro River, the boundary Rome had set in the treaty that ended the First Punic War. It was a calculated violation. It was a declaration of intent. Rome had to respond. The Second Punic War began, but Hannibal didn't do what Rome expected. Rome expected him to fight in Spain. Instead, he did something that shocked the ancient world. In the spring of 218 BC, Hannibal marched his army north to the Pyrenees, then to the Alps. He was marching to Italy. With 46,000 men and 37 elephants, the passage took 5 months. It was one of the greatest feats of logistics and human endurance in the ancient world. Thousands of men died in the mountains. Horses fell off cliffs. The elephants had to be coaxed through passes they'd never seen before. But in the fall of 218 BC, Hannibal emerged from the Alps into the Italian plain. He had lost nearly half his men, but he still had an army. And he had something more important. He had momentum. Over the next 2 years, Hannibal did something that had never been done before. He defeated the Roman army repeatedly. At the Trebia River in 218 BC, he crushed a Roman force and killed 20,000 men. At Lake Trasimene in 217 BC, he smashed another army and killed another 15,000. The Romans were shocked. Their legions were trained, disciplined, powerful, but they'd never fought anyone like Hannibal. He moved faster than them. He thought further ahead than them. He understood the terrain in ways they didn't. By 216 BC, the Roman Senate was in panic. After 18 months of defeats, the Republic decided it was time to stop being cautious. The Romans appointed two new consuls, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro, and gave them the largest army ever assembled in Roman history, 87,000 men, 8 legions, thousands of cavalry, food trains stretching for miles. This was Rome's answer to Hannibal. Overwhelming numbers. Paulus and Varro were different men. Paulus was cautious, experienced, patrician from the old noble families. Varro was aggressive, ambitious, popularly elected. He represented the political forces pushing for aggressive action. As the two consuls marched their massive armies south toward Hannibal, they were confident. How could they lose? They outnumbered him nearly 2-1. Their legions were the most disciplined infantry in the world. They had come to end this war. They didn't know they were marching toward the most catastrophic defeat Rome would suffer for centuries. Hannibal didn't choose Cannae randomly. He chose it because the terrain was perfect for what he was about to do. The plain near Cannae was flat and open, perfect for cavalry, the one area where Hannibal had a real advantage. The Aufidus River ran along one side, which meant the Romans would be hemmed in. The valley gradually narrowed as you went south, which meant armies fighting there would get more compressed, more packed together. And most importantly, the sun rose in the east, which meant the Romans, if they came from the north as expected, would be facing south into the blinding glare and dust. Hannibal had seized a supply depot at Cannae, a vital food storage for the Roman army. When Varro heard that Hannibal had taken it, he knew he had to fight. He couldn't let that stand. The two armies made camp about 5 miles apart. That night, the Roman consuls argued. Paulus warned that the open plain was exactly where Hannibal wanted to fight cavalry country. He argued for patience, for maneuvering, for taking time to position themselves better. Varro disagreed vehemently. He wanted to fight now. He wanted to use the Roman legion's greatest strength, their disciplined, compact, crushing power when pressed together. The two consuls were supposed to alternate command each day. Roman law required that. On August 2nd, it was Varro's turn to command. And Varro did what Hannibal was counting on. He advanced the army, 87,000 men in formation, marching toward the Carthaginian lines. The Romans arranged themselves in a formation that was actually quite clever given what they believed they faced. They put their cavalry on the wings, about 6,000 horsemen, with the heavier Italian cavalry under Paulus on the right wing and lighter allied cavalry on the left. In the center, they massed their heavy infantry. About 70,000 men arranged in a dense, deep formation. Deeper than normal, actually. Tighter than normal. The idea was simple. Hit Hannibal's center with overwhelming weight and push straight through. Roman legions were trained for this, the push, the crush, the relentless forward pressure of disciplined infantry. If they could break Hannibal's center line, the whole Carthaginian army would split in half. It was a sound strategy. Against most armies, it would have worked. But Hannibal was not most generals. As the Roman army marched toward him, Hannibal studied it carefully. He could see exactly how they'd arranged themselves. He could see the deep center. He could see the cavalry on the wings. He could see Varro's confidence, and he knew exactly what was about to happen. Hannibal had arranged his army in a way that seemed crazy. His center, facing the Roman legions, was composed of his weakest infantry, Gallic and Iberian troops, who had less training, less armor, less discipline than his best soldiers. Behind them, he had positioned his elite African infantry veteran soldiers, heavily armed, experienced. They were on small knolls on either flank, positioned to see what happened in the center but not directly in the path of the Roman advance. And behind everything, in hidden positions on the slopes, he had positioned his cavalry, his heavy cavalry, the strongest part of his army. This formation, this crescent shape with the weakest troops in front and the strongest troops on the sides and back violated every rule of ancient warfare. You didn't put your worst soldiers in front of the enemy's strongest force. You didn't deliberately create a gap for the enemy to push through. You didn't arrange your army so that it looked like you were about to be defeated. But that's exactly what Hannibal had done. When the Roman legions hit Hannibal's center, something incredible happened. Instead of holding firm, instead of fighting for every inch, Hannibal's center line deliberately gave ground, not in a panicked, rout-like way, but in a controlled, organized withdrawal. The Gallic and Iberian troops fought, but they slowly fell back. The Romans pushed forward, advancing deeper and deeper into Hannibal's line, and as the Romans pushed forward, they pushed deeper into a narrowing formation. Remember, the plain itself was getting narrower as they went south, and Hannibal's line was shaped like a crescent, wider at the edges, narrower in the center. So the more the Romans pushed forward, the more compressed they became. The Romans couldn't see this from ground level. All they could see was that Hannibal's center was breaking. They thought they were winning. They pushed harder, deeper, crushing the Gallic troops, driving forward toward what they thought was Hannibal's complete defeat. But Hannibal was watching. He was waiting for the precise moment. He was counting the Roman soldiers pouring into the trap. He was waiting until the moment was perfect. Then he gave the signal. The moment Hannibal had been waiting for had arrived. The Roman legions had pushed so far into his center that they were now surrounded on three sides. They were packed so tightly together that they couldn't maneuver, couldn't spread out, couldn't even turn to face threats coming from unexpected directions. Now it was time to close the trap. From the flanks, Hannibal's elite African infantry swept forward. These were his best soldiers, his veterans, the men he'd been saving for this moment. They weren't trying to push the Romans back. They were trying to swing inward, to compress the Roman formation even more, to cut off any possibility of the legions reorganizing. At the same time, from the sloping ground behind Cannae, Hannibal's cavalry burst into motion. The heavy cavalry, the shock troops, the riders that had proven they could crush any enemy they'd encountered, but they didn't charge forward to hit the Roman front. They did something more devastating. They wheeled around and hit the Roman army from behind. The Romans' cavalry stationed on the wings tried to stop them, but Hannibal's cavalry was better trained, better equipped, better led. The Roman cavalry was quickly overwhelmed and scattered. Their horses fell. Their riders were cut down. Once the Roman cavalry was broken, Hannibal's cavalry did something that sealed the fate of the entire Roman army. They rode directly into the rear of the Roman infantry. Imagine being a Roman legionary. You're packed shoulder to shoulder with thousands of other men. Your formation is everything. It's your protection, your strength, your discipline. You're pushing forward against Hannibal's line, expecting to break through any second. Then suddenly, behind you, you hear the thundering of hooves. Hannibal's cavalry is attacking you from behind. You can't turn around effectively because you're too packed in with your fellow soldiers. You can't charge the cavalry because you're locked in formation with the men next to you. You can't retreat because there's nowhere to go. The army behind you is pushing forward too. The Roman formation, which had been the source of their strength, became the source of their doom. They were trapped in it. They were packed so tightly that they could barely swing their weapons. They were being crushed from three sides and attacked from behind. And the compression only got worse. As Hannibal's flanks pushed inward and his cavalry continued to hammer from behind, the Roman legions were forced into smaller and smaller spaces. Men were pressed against each other so tightly they could barely breathe. One historian describes soldiers standing in the massive Roman formation, unable to move, unable to fight effectively, essentially waiting to be killed. The ground became slick with blood, bodies piled up, and still the Carthaginians kept pressing, kept closing the space, kept compressing the Roman army. In the center of this horror, where the original Roman advance had been deepest, the slaughter was almost apocalyptic. Thousands of Romans were simply cut down. They didn't die in glorious combat. They died crushed in their own formation, unable to move, unable to fight back effectively. By afternoon, the battle was essentially over. The Roman army, which had marched into the plain that morning with 87,000 men, had been completely surrounded and was being methodically destroyed. Varro, seeing that the battle was lost, managed to gather a few thousand survivors and escape. He rode back to Rome, where he was actually praised for surviving and warning the Romans had such low survival expectations that the fact that he didn't die in the battle was considered worthy of recognition. Paulus, the more cautious consul, didn't escape. He died on the battlefield, fighting among his men. It was, in a sense, the only honorable thing available to him. When the slaughter finally ended, the numbers were staggering. The Romans had lost approximately 50,000 to 70,000 men killed, another 10,000 were captured. Estimates suggest that roughly 14,000 to 15,000 Romans survived the battle. Hannibal's losses were about 6,000 men, roughly 10% of his army. In a single day, in a single battle, Hannibal had destroyed 8 Roman legions. To put this in perspective, that's like the first day of the Somme in World War I. It's like Gettysburg. It's one of the deadliest single days of combat in human history, and it happened on a plain in southern Italy in 216 BC, executed with a tactic so bold, so counterintuitive, that no general had the courage to try it again for nearly 2,000 years. When the news of Cannae reached Rome, the city went into absolute panic. The Senate had lost 8 legions. The flower of Roman manhood was dead. The wife of one senator received a letter telling her that her husband had been killed and she needed to prepare for a new husband. Such was the mortality rate among Roman nobles in the battle. Women of the upper classes were explicitly forbidden from wearing mourning clothes in public, because so many people had died that if everyone wore black, the city would look like a graveyard. Rome was traumatized. The political ramifications were immediate. Varro, having escaped, expected to face execution for his role in the disaster. Instead, the Senate actually voted to praise him for surviving. That shows how desperate Rome had become. Survival itself seemed like an accomplishment. More importantly, the Senate realized that the strategy of meeting Hannibal in open battle had failed catastrophically. They appointed Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator and authorized him to pursue a new strategy. Fabius's strategy was revolutionary: avoid pitched battles with Hannibal. Instead, pass his supply lines, attack his foraging parties, force him to fight small battles on Roman terms, wear him down through attrition rather than trying to destroy him in one grand encounter. It was cautious. It was boring. It was unpopular. But it worked. Over the next years, Hannibal's army, which had no way to replenish its losses, began to weaken. His Italian allies, expecting him to march on Rome after Cannae, became disillusioned when he didn't. Several of them defected back to Rome. And eventually, Rome raised a new general, Scipio Africanus, who learned from Cannae and developed countermeasures to Hannibal's tactics. In 202 BC, at the Battle of Zama, Scipio defeated Hannibal using lessons learned from studying the Carthaginians' victory. Rome won the war, but it took 16 years, and the dominant memory in Roman consciousness wasn't victory, it was Cannae. It was the day the greatest military power in the world was destroyed by a general half their size. But here's the truly remarkable thing about Cannae. For nearly 2,000 years, no other general had the courage to try Hannibal's double envelopment tactic. Frederick the Great studied Cannae and tried to replicate it, but his subordinates were too cautious. Napoleon walked through the Alps retracing Hannibal's steps, admiring the general, but never quite daring to attempt his most famous maneuver in a real battle. Von Moltke, the German general, studied Cannae obsessively. The entire German war strategy in World War I was inspired by Hannibal's double envelopment. But the terrain of France, the defensive power of trenches, and the killing power of modern artillery made the tactic impossible to execute. The reason was simple. Hannibal's double envelopment requires perfect execution. It requires that your center hold long enough to be a convincing target while your flanks wheel around. It requires that your cavalry maintain discipline and hit at exactly the right moment. It requires that your troops don't panic when it looks like they're losing. It requires that your enemy commits fully to attacking your center. Miss any of those elements, and the entire tactic collapses. The risks were enormous. If Hannibal's center had broken too early, the Roman legions would have scattered and escaped. If his cavalry hadn't defeated the Roman cavalry decisively, the Romans could have wheeled to meet the flanking attack. If Varro had been slightly more cautious, the Romans might have held reserves that could have counterattacked the encirclement. Any of 100 small changes and Cannae becomes a catastrophic Roman victory instead of a catastrophic Roman defeat. But in World War II, one general finally attempted something similar. Norman Schwarzkopf, the commander of the Allied forces in the Gulf War, studied Cannae intensely. When he planned Operation Desert Storm, he deliberately arranged the invasion to encircle and destroy the Iraqi army. The plan was essentially Cannae applied to modern warfare. The U.S. and Allied forces would attack from the south and east, drawing the Iraqi army's attention and commitment. Meanwhile, coalition forces would swing around through the desert to the west, encircling the Iraqi army and cutting off retreat. The tactic worked. The Iraqi army was surrounded, compressed, and destroyed. Schwarzkopf acknowledged afterward that he had studied Hannibal's double envelopment and based his strategy on it. It had taken nearly 2,000 years for a commander to have the courage and the tactical opportunity to try what Hannibal had achieved at Cannae. So, why does Cannae matter so much? Why do military academies around the world still teach it? Why did generals like Eisenhower and Schwarzkopf study it? The answer is that Cannae represents something profound about warfare and about strategy itself. Cannae is the purest example of what military strategists call the Battle of Annihilation. A battle where you don't just defeat the enemy, you destroy them so completely that they cease to exist as a fighting force. But Cannae teaches something more subtle. It teaches that victory isn't about having the biggest army. It's about understanding the enemy's assumptions and using those assumptions against them. The Romans assumed that they would win because they were stronger, more numerous, and more disciplined. Hannibal understood that those same qualities, that discipline, that formation, that commitment to the frontal assault could become weaknesses if exploited correctly. He didn't try to outfight the Romans in a traditional sense. He turned their strength against them. He made them compress themselves into a smaller and smaller space until they couldn't move, couldn't maneuver, couldn't take advantage of their numbers. It's almost judo-like using the opponent's own force against them. Every military academy in the world teaches Cannae not just as a historical battle, but as a fundamental lesson in strategy. Know your enemy's assumptions, understand what they think they can do, then arrange the battlefield so that those assumptions become fatal weaknesses. Eisenhower wrote, "Every ground commander seeks the battle of annihilation. So far as conditions permit, he tries to duplicate in modern war the classic example of Cannae." That's profound. What he's saying is that every commander wants to win decisively, but they want to do it like Hannibal did not, through superior force, but through superior understanding. Hannibal was outnumbered 2-1. He had no advantages except superior generalship and superior understanding of what his enemy would do. And with those alone, he destroyed the greatest army in the ancient world. That's why Cannae still matters. That's why it's still taught. Because in warfare and in strategy generally, understanding beats numbers. Vision beats resources. The ability to see what others can't see, to predict what others can't predict. That's what makes Hannibal's Cannae eternal. So why call it the Forbidden Formation? Because for nearly 2,000 years, no general dared attempt it. It was so dangerous, so risky, so counterintuitive, that it became almost mythical, a tactic so perfect that trying to replicate it was seen as hubris. The very thing that made it brilliant, the deliberate weakening of the center, the reliance on perfectly timed flanking movements, the faith that your troops wouldn't panic when it looked like they were losing those same things made it nearly impossible to execute. Other generals tried. Frederick the Great's subordinates refused to maintain the center line because they were afraid of the risk. Napoleon studied it, but never implemented it. Von Moltke planned it, but the modern warfare of trenches and barbed wire made it impossible. The risk-reward calculation was terrifying. If it worked, you annihilated an army. If it failed, you were utterly defeated. The center of your formation would collapse. Your flanks would be unsupported, and you'd be overrun by superior numbers. There was no middle ground. There was no close enough. It had to work perfectly, or you lost everything. Only in the Gulf War, with modern technology, perfect intelligence, and a massive firepower advantage that made cavalry maneuvers unnecessary, could a commander finally try again what Hannibal had done in 216 BC. That's the true measure of Hannibal's genius. He created a tactic so perfect, so balanced on the edge of impossible success, that it took 2,000 years in modern warfare before anyone had both the courage and the conditions to attempt it again. Hannibal didn't win the Second Punic War. Rome did. 16 years after Cannae, he was defeated and forced to flee Carthage. He died in exile, an old man in a foreign land, never seeing his homeland again. But his legacy wasn't military victory. His legacy was a single perfect Battle of Cannae that proved that understanding, innovation, and courage could accomplish what seemed impossible. He was outnumbered 2-1. He had no allies left in the Mediterranean. His supply lines were stretched across thousands of miles. and yet he destroyed an army bigger than all his remaining forces combined. How? Not by having more. By understanding more. Not by being stronger. By being smarter. Not by fighting the battle Rome expected, but by creating a battle so different, so devastating, that Rome's entire military doctrine had to be rebuilt from scratch. The double envelopment never worked again until 2,000 years later. That tells you everything you need to know about how perfect Cannae was, and how impossible it is to replicate brilliance. But perhaps that's the real lesson. Maybe the greatest victories in history aren't won by doing what everyone does, just better. Maybe they're won by doing something no one has the courage to try, and doing it flawlessly. That was Hannibal. That was Cannae. That was the forbidden formation that, for 2,000 years, no one dared attempt. Hannibal's victory at Cannae did not lead to the conquest of Rome, but it proved something more valuable: that military genius could overcome any disadvantage of numbers. This lesson shaped warfare for 2,000 years,